Well, hello, everyone. We are here today with Yat Siu, who's one of the Hong Kong's famous entrepreneurs. He is in this new space of metaverse and blockchain in a big way. He's the chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands, which is really the top open metaverse player in Asia. And we're going to hear a lot about what he's up to and how Animoca is also investing in some of these companies that are in the NFT space. So hello, Yat, how are you today?
Great, and thank you for having me.
Oh, we're so glad to have you here. You're just a real expert and a real leader of the entrepreneurial scene in Hong Kong as well. First, I found it really fascinating about your background that you actually grew up in Vienna and your parents were musicians. And I've always heard that music and math and computer skills, that they go together. So it seems in your case that maybe that's so.
Well, that's it's interesting, right? Because I think one of the interesting things about music is that I think the biggest skill I took back from learning music is discipline. Because one of the things about music is that while there are the creative elements, I think that really came from the environment I grew up in. Growing up in I grew up in Vienna. I was born and raised there, and as you said, my parents both studied music. My mother became a professional musician. And I think the one thing that really sort of I absorbed was the culture around me. And I think this is the part, perhaps, if looking back, that mattered to me there, because, in our family home setting, in the friends that we had, is mostly discussions about culture, about humanity, about the arts. It was less about sort of, money or economics or that type of stuff, because certainly in the 70s and 80s, that wasn't the thinking. But also growing up in Vienna, I was also in the middle of sort of, the Cold War, right? I mean, the United Nations was in Vienna. There was, the Eastern Bloc countries of the past, right? The border issues, the Berlin Wall, right? So the whole environment in which I sort of grew up, together with the literature and the culture of the time, music and arts on one hand, spy novels on the others, right? and conspiracy theories and all that stuff, provided for a very interesting backdrop, I think, in the way that I grew up. So all of that, however, which I think is an interesting reflection where we are today, centered around sort of, I guess the humanity and the arts and culture around all of that. But it is because of computers that I actually discovered, because of music that I actually discovered the computer, because I was not particularly gifted in music, right? And so some of my sort of, fellow students, it was just really great. My mother had perfect pitch, so she could just, literally just listen to something and it'll just pop up in her head. I didn't have that gift. And I'm an only child. And so all aspirations and musical hopes, I guess, were centered around the child who was not particularly gifted in music. But I used a computer to help me with composition. I wrote software that basically would help me sort of, I guess you could call, back then people may have said it's a little bit like cheating, right? Because it's like using a calculator in a math quiz. I ended up basically using a computer to help me compose faster, because it was more natural for me to play on a keyboard attached to a MIDI port and then basically edit that than using pen and paper. That was just not something that I was particularly good at. That didn't really help me in school, but it helped me basically find opportunity online through a service called CompuServe, where I uploaded the software. And back in the day, people didn't care about sort of, privacy. They just basically just put all that whole address on details there and said, hey, if you like the software, then come send me some money. That's basically what I did, not hoping that anyone would send me money. It was just purely bragging rights. And then literally sort of months after, I started receiving checks in the mail from strangers I did not know. And I didn't have a bank account because I was 13 years old. So that was kind of the background as to sort of how I got into tech. And I think really for me, that's how I made friendships online through CompuServe with people I did not know, right? I was using acoustic coupler to connect, afterwards a modem, right? So it's a really pre-metaverse, pre-internet type service, super primitive. But, I guess that's how I found my opportunity. And it later led me to a job at Atari, which, again, seemed random at the time. But, I think just to reflect, I was an Asian minority in Vienna that did not have many Asians or Chinese, period, right? I was a child, and yet I was still able to basically get into a sort of I guess a tech job, simply because of what I knew and what I could do, not because of how old I was or perhaps what I appeared to be. But also, to be fair, in the 80s, having a job in tech was not anything to be celebrated. Right? It was
Not like
some,
today.
yeah, not like today. It was more like, oh, that's weird. What are you doing? I don't understand. But okay, fine. You know.
And also then going to Asia was kind of looked at as different than it is today. Today it's looked at as a real opportunity, or it was before COVID anyhow. You know, traveling internationally, going to Asia. But you went to Asia early on.
Yeah, I basically came to Hong Kong, and because my father's from Hong Kong, I guess I had permanent residency, so I could just stay here. But you know, through a series of opportunities, including starting a company after Atari went under in the early 90s. Now, at that point, I was in the US. I ended up coming to Asia through an acquisition by SGI, which is another company that maybe some people might not have remembered. But in fact, SGI was a very common occurrence in CES, right? Because they were the leading sort of visual graphics computer system at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, they were pushing this thing called WebForce, and had acquired sort of the company I was with, and that led me to Asia. As you said, I was the only Asian on that team, sort of writing basically software that was supporting at the time VRML, which is basically an early version and of VR, and it basically was the HTML equivalent of a VR, based on OpenGL. And they needed people to help basically spread and support that in Asia, when SGI was really sort of trying to run behind sort of Sun Microsystems as the new internet machine at the time. So I went to Japan, I went to Taiwan, and then came to Hong Kong. And I realized that I could live here because of my father. And I also realized that I could get my internet. So they didn't even have a CompuServe node. So I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I guess in the classic, somewhat foolish but entrepreneurial spirit, I said, well, why don't I just start a sort of an ISP in Hong Kong? Because we need internet. Internet was good to me, so I think internet should be good for everyone else. So I started an ISP. That was I think I was 19 or 20 at the time. I was quite young. So I didn't have a business degree or a business school background, anything like that. So I didn't have a business plan. And it was really difficult because I literally felt like I was selling sort of fridges to Eskimos, because everyone really didn't know why they needed this. But it taught me a few things about being really early, and I guess taught me something about business grid. Before eventually starting Outblaze, which was basically a very early cloud computing business, although they wouldn't call it cloud back then. It was called ASP in 1998. And with that business, I guess that was later acquired by IBM. I guess was one of the very first, I guess, maybe earlier, slightly bigger tech experiences that Hong Kong had.
Right. So now with the metaverse, where does Asia stand in relation to other markets around the world in its adaptation of the metaverse and the whole ecosystem around the metaverse? Where is Asia? And where is Hong Kong in that? How does Hong Kong factor in too?
Well, I think this is one of those moments in time where actually the playing field is relatively open still, because we're so early, right? It's like smartphone, mobile phone, sort of in terms of most recent times, smartphone and mobile phone development back in 2008, 2009, just when it was emerging. It was really sort of anyone's game to sort of emerge. And it was because of the smartphone, for instance, that, in the early days, you had HTC come up, right? And then you had Samsung and LG, from a sort of handset standpoint, actually, Asia really emerged as a global leader because of the smartphone in terms of the hardware side of things. And even on manufacturing, after all, everything that you're using on your iPhone actually comes from this part of the world, right? So I think it's a similar opportunity. But let me just make a distinction between sort of, when people talk about the metaverse, it's still a vague term for many, because they're like, well, what is the metaverse? You could argue that maybe we're already in a kind of quasi-metaverse, because when you think about your daily interaction, what's the first thing you do? Probably you're on an online device, right? Mm-hmm. How much time do you spend on Instagram, on WhatsApp, on WeChat, and all these services? Mm-hmm. And what do you do later on? Do you probably play a game? When you take the sum total of the hours that you're spending, you're probably already virtual most of the time. And so one could argue that we're already in a kind of metaverse, right? And many of the companies out there that are saying we're building the metaverse, whether this is Facebook, aptly renamed Meta as of late, or even game companies like Roblox, or studios like Epic, with games like Fortnite, or even in China, right? I mean, both Tencent and Alibaba have been registering, Chinese equivalent trademarks for metaverse, right? So they would all say that we're kind of building the metaverse already, but these are all closed metaverses. They're actually not real metaverses as far as we're defining those, right? And so it's important to make that distinction, because if you say, well, if you're a metaverse like Facebook, then you could say it's already here and we're experiencing it, which is somewhat true, but we're entirely dependent on them, right? We're basically renting on their platforms. We don't own any of that, right? So we're dependent on that. And just imagine what happens if you are removed. Every day, software developers get removed from the Apple App Store for reasons that they don't fully comprehend. Every day, rules are being changed at Apple and Instagram in terms of how you can be discovered, right? So it's like changing the laws of a country, but on a regular occurrence. And then we're expected to survive and do well in those business environments, right? So that's kind of the circumstance of those. What we're building is the open metaverse. It's based on blockchain, which basically means that the data paradigms are owned by everyone. And, we can talk a little later about NFTs, but NFTs basically represent the actual property rights that you can actually have in this open metaverse. And in that sense, I would say that Asia is not sort of leading just yet, only because of the fact that it's a fairly new technology. But if you look at historically, Asia hasn't normally been the place where everyone where innovation starts right away, right? If you look at sort of the birth of the internet, even if you look at smartphone, the creation and everything. So it's not that necessarily that happens really strong in this part of the world, but the adoption rate, the acceleration rate, in this part of the world is awesome, right? And so I fully expect it to be very quick. Where we as Animoca brands have built ourselves up, and many of our earliest investments and growth actually came from the West. It came from the US and Europe. The sandbox, it really sort of is, that studio actually that built it is actually in Argentina, but they've had most of their growth in the US actually and in Europe. The next part of their office is in Paris, right? As an example, and we have also holdings in OpenSea, which is also US based, or Dapper Labs, which is also North America based, right? And so on. So that was in the early days when we got involved in this space, really 4 or 5 years ago. But now, of course, a lot is emerging in Asia, and where do the customers come from? The customers are actually mostly in Asia, who are online, who are digitally very connected, and for us, the transition in this part of the world is natural because they're already in a kind of pre-metaverse. So if they can then move into the real metaverse as we would define it, I think this part of our region is going to do really well.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, so the customers for this are probably all, I mean, is it mostly male or not? Mostly male, teens, 20s?
I mean, I think, interestingly enough, it is not mostly male, although I would say a majority is male, but it's not like a skewed ratio, like, 99% male, 1% female, right? And I think it has a lot to do with the engagement of, at least for open metaverse, interest that a lot of women are actually really interested in the whole field of crypto. So they may not necessarily be looking at non-fungible tokens right away, but they're interested in this new form of value, this new form of money that they're sort of looking at. And so actually understanding crypto is essentially one way to start entering into the open metaverse, because the whole crypto scene actually created a banking system and a money system for this metaverse. And the non-fungible tokens represented the objects and things like property, like houses in the real world, but in the digital world of the metaverse. So the interaction is natural in that sense. And if you think about the explosion of what happened with non-fungible tokens, for instance, where everyone's going like sort of, for the expensive artwork and the expensive, items and virtual cars and, virtual characters to play with, it seems almost fantastic. But actually, this was only possible because of last year's DeFi summer. For those who were sort of in the crypto scene, actually what DeFi summer created was a banking system, an entirely permissionless, open virtual banking system, which we at the surface, for most of us, interact on the level of, oh, I hold some Bitcoin, oh, I hold some Ethereum. That's more as a holder activity, but actually there's a full-on banking system that can be utilized to generate yield, to create products and services on top of it. And after that was well established with billions of dollars of value locked, the non-fungible tokens, which represented the assets and objects, became basically products that banking could service. So now you have lending, you have mortgaging, you're financing, all of these things that banking traditionally offers in the physical world, but entirely virtual. And people started to build on top of these platforms. And the combination of the two actually is what created today what we see with the open metaverse, where people are basically having full-time employment in those areas, billions of dollars of values being created. And each of these metaverses, like our sandbox or our portfolio Axie Infinity, they should no longer be viewed as a company. They are in fact like a nation, like a country. And the value of their entire economy is measured in the form of a virtual GDP instead of a sort of PE.
Yeah, and the growth rates are phenomenal, aren't they? I mean, give us a few examples of what this growth rate is like.
Yeah, I mean, so an example, for instance, just for ourselves, right? I mean, our income in the first 9 months of the year, basically shot up to, over $500 million, which is, quite an amazing number for where we were even just a year ago. But then, for instance, like for Sandbox, obviously crypto markets are volatile, but it's fully diluted token valuation at $1.20 billion, right? It's like, which is pretty significant given where it was. And sort of its economic impact and the volume of trade is in the billions of dollars a day, right? So this basically, so when you start to measure something just like Sandbox, it actually now has an economic activity, and it's an imperfect measure, of course, but the economic activity around the Sandbox and the trading of its virtual land and its assets, as well as its token, if you were to annualize it, is actually now amongst the top 100 countries in the world, right? So, so of course it's an imperfect analogy, but it just gives you a size of the scale of what happens there, because the people in the Sandbox are actual virtual citizens. We have people who are sort of metaverse architects, who are now almost 20 or 30 people in size, who make their full-time living building virtual homes, for others in the metaverse. And, in Hong Kong, for instance, the biggest real estate developers, like New World or Sun Kai Financial, they all bought land on the Sandbox and now are developing on top of it. And that's kind of fascinating, because on one hand, you might say, well, this is virtual land. What does it all mean? But actually, the purpose of virtual land is the same as it is in the physical land. It's not the house itself, it's where the house is that matters, right? It's the reason why, New York or San Francisco or London or Hong Kong are the centers that they are. Not because you can have the biggest homes, but because, the embedded network effect, the sort of influence of that region is so desirable. When Snoop Dogg, for instance, purchased land in Sandbox, obviously he created a sensation, and he was building, a cool experience. He sold his tickets to his virtual mansion. They're going for like $2,000 now after the initial sale, because people just want to hang out with Snoop, right? And land even around Snoop Dogg is now worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, because it's kind of becoming sort of the mini Beverly Hills of within the Sandbox, right? So it's fascinating how many of the same principles that we see in the physical world actually apply completely in the virtual one.
Yeah. So what about the economic cycle? So, I mean, if you talk about this comparing it to a country GDP or whatever, that has cycles. We go through boom and bust cycles all the time. And in this metaverse world, is that also the case? And how do you prepare for that?
So I think as there's massive growth, it's natural that you see cycles of sort of, a massive boom and then some correction. And that happens all the time. But I think the way that we look at this is, one, there's still only millions of people in the open metaverse. But there's billions of people in the gaming world, for instance, 3.2 billion people, who are all basically still in a closed metaverse. And there's an important distinction here, right? Because we think everyone from closed will eventually go to open because it's better for the user. It's not better for the game company, maybe, but it's better for the user. And so from our point of view, what's better for our virtual citizens, as it were, is where they're going to actually move to eventually once they realize. In the same way that you'd much rather be in a democratic framework where you have rights, as opposed to being in a totalitarian environment where basically you're dictated to, right?
Mhm.
It's basically the same principle. And I think the other thing is the growth of this economic activity will come on new innovations that are adapted on top of it. The example being that in human history, because we have property, because we have ownership of property, you can compose new experiences and businesses on top of it because you have the certainty of doing so. If I buy a house and I know I own it, I'm going to invest more in the renovation. I'm going to put more stuff into it because I know it can be there, or at least I own it. If I rent it, I'm only going to have a limited investment. I'm only going to do so much because I know it's not mine and it won't be permanent. The digital world is entirely rental at the moment. Our engagement and our attention of focus on what we apparently own in the virtual world is that of rental. So we don't care much. It affects retention rates, is how we engage with the platforms. We have no loyalty to anything. We just hop around, right? So everything is attention focused. But when you actually start going into ownership, that shifts, right? In the same way that we're seeing with our metaverses, the retention rates are 50 to 70%, sort of on D30. We're talking about players that are literally living there the whole time. Game companies would kill for those kind of retention rates, but
Yeah.
they can't have those because, it's all rented and the players basically don't have any value in there. So they just move away from one place to another. But actually, if you could own your virtual items in a game and you can, if you want to trade them or pass them on or keep them forever, why wouldn't you want to do that? Then play somewhere where eventually you'll lose everything in due course.
Right, right. So now your company is actually investing in many of these new metaverse companies and crypto companies. And how many investments have you done so far? And how's your pace of investing now? Are you continuing to invest pretty aggressively, or how is your pace now?
So it's even more aggressive than it was 4 years ago. Because 4 years ago we didn't have that much money, so we couldn't be as aggressive as we like to.
Okay, I see.
But either way, so we started very early, I guess, in 2018, and many of those companies have done very well. We've also built our own, like the Sandbox or Rev Racing or Tower and so on. But really, at this point, we are well over 100 investments in this space.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons we invest like this, because we're not a fund, so everything's on a balance sheet, right? So the reason we invest so aggressively as well is because we believe in this shared network effect. So with Web3, the whole concept is that we can now own a piece of the network. And therefore, by owning a piece of the network, we can benefit from the shared network effect. By owning an NFT, I actually have a piece of property that gives me sort of, an access to the network effect embedded within everything. So that makes sense then to start investing broadly to help facilitate the growth of that. So we've invested in NFT lending platforms, we've invested in protocols, layer ones, layer twos, as well as many blockchain games, and so forth, because we need to also bring more people into that space. So that's kind of, we're in a bit of a hurry because we think the threat also isn't actually, regulation or so on. We think that's a positive thing actually when as it comes. But we think it's actually groups like Facebook, for instance, or Tencent, because this business model of an open metaverse is very much in contradiction to the way they've currently constructed their business. It is very disruptive to them because, right now, the tax rate of, for instance, a game studio or a company like Facebook is 100%. All the data that you give to Facebook, which makes Facebook valuable, actually doesn't belong to you. You may think you own the data itself, but the network effect that is generated from the data, which is where the value lies, belongs exclusively to Facebook, right? But do they pay you for this? The answer is, of course, no. Do you own a share of this? And the answer is also no. So we are willingly surrendering all of our insights, all of our data. And that's why they're so powerful. It's like getting free oil or free cotton, right? We're not getting paid for that at all. And in the inverse, the open metaverse pays you for that. So players in Axie Infinity, which is one of our most successful portfolios, you have millions of people in the world, in places like the Philippines, literally lifted out of poverty, who, because of COVID, couldn't make any money, but were making $50 a month, are now making $250 to $500 a month. And it may seem from the outside like, well, how can he make so much money playing a game at a scale, in the size of billions of dollars from an economic standpoint? Well, it's not actually because money is just being created. It's because value was already locked because of the time that people spend to add to the network effect. Meaning that the free players or the players who spend their time in a game or on Facebook or on Instagram are actually adding to that network effect. Because if we do not use Facebook or we do not play our free games, actually the game would not be valuable because people wouldn't pay for the services that essentially our free time gives them. So the paradigm has to change. We either get paid for giving our time, like work, or we take a percentage or a share of ownership of what was created, right? Which is basically basic capitalism at work here. There's nothing new about this, right? And so this has really sort of changed that paradigm. And again, if you can actually make money playing a game because you're actually contributing to the network effect anyway, then why would you ever want to play a game where you're never rewarded for anything, right? So that's basically how we see and why we think this is an inevitable movement.
Wow. You really explain it well, and I think you're right in the thick of it too, right in the center of it. It'll be really interesting to follow you and see how this all plays out over the coming years. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that was super. I really learned a lot, and I think all the audience members did too. Again, thank you, and we'll see you next time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Bye now.